If you would open your Bibles to Psalm 77. Psalm 77. If anyone has endured a trial, suffering, emotional pain, any of life's difficulties, we can definitely relate to the words that are written here in this psalm by a guy by the name of Asaph. Have we ever questioned God when it seemed like He wasn't keeping His promises? If so, we'll want to learn about, I think he's one of the great men of the faith in the Bible that ask a lot of questions. And he was tested definitely by God. And again, his name is Asaph. And if you go to the book of Chronicles, you find out that he was David's musical director. Today we'd say he was Drew. He's the song leader. Okay? Asaph wrote Psalm 50, and then he also wrote Psalm 73 all the way through 83. And one of the things that you can't help but appreciate about him is he's straightforward and honest. I mean, he writes down his emotions while dealing with his problems, and reading about his situation, I think, helps us to relate to the feelings that we have at times. Asaph also complained and questioned God, and God allowed it. This psalm, the context, it kind of it deals with the Lord's apparent rejection of His people. I mean, Asaph's just suffering and wrestling with the meaning of terrible events that he was seeing happening in his life and also in God's people's lives. And this apparent gap between what he believed and what he felt was very painful. So in this psalm, he described kind of how he moved from a lot of disappointment and despair to confidence that God would take care of His people. Look at the first 3 verses there that Larry read for us. You know, sometimes in life, all we can see is darkness. And really, the first 9 verses of this psalm, Asaph is unable to sleep. Notice in verse 2. In the night my hand was stretched out with weariness. Verse 4, look at this. He's blaming God. He says, God has kept my eyelids open. So he's unable to sleep. So he begins to pray. And then that eventually goes into remembering. But then you find him questioning God. Now here's the thing. We would expect often after praying and remembering that we would read, he was trusting in God. But instead, what we see, he's still doubting. This is a very typical psalm of Asaph when you read his writings, because they're just intermingled with faith and doubt. Now look there in verse 1. He says, my voice rises to God. You know, in times of crisis, in times of pain, prayer is the Christians, I guess in our computer world today, would say default. It should be our natural response. And Asaph reached out his hands in the darkness and cried out to God. Literally there in verse 1, when it talks about my voice rises to God and he cries aloud, in the Hebrew, that literally means to wail. So I think a lesson there for us in days of trouble must be days of prayer. and pray hardest when it's hardest to pray. Even if our prayers are wails to God. In verse 2, the message reads this way: my life was an open wound that wouldn't heal. Last phrase of verse 2, he says, my soul, look at this, he says, my soul refused to be comforted. And those kind of describe the nature of suffering and grief. I mean, Asaph is saying nothing can be said to him that will make him feel better. I mean, he literally felt like there was no place to find comfort. Now think about this. This is the guy who was leading the singing in worship back in that day, and yet he finds himself having no comfort for his own heart. Also there in verse 2, that word trouble, it just means a tight spot. I mean, Asaph's suffering was so severe, he's just wearied that, he begins to question the goodness and the grace of God. Verse 3, notice this word that we're going to see several times in here, the word remember. When he remembered the Lord and pondered the matter, notice what it says: when I remember God, then I'm disturbed. When I sigh, my spirit grows faint. You know, he felt as if the Lord had abandoned him. And you know, there are moments in the lives of all Christians when God and His ways make no sense. Even when we've exhausted ourselves in prayer, and Asaph is saying, you know what, the only thing left to do is sigh. And sometimes our pain is so intense that's literally all you can do is sigh. But in those times of despair and sighing, I want us to remember Romans 8:26. That's where, you remember, Paul tells us of the Holy Spirit who intercedes for Christians when they're trying to pray, and all we can do is sigh and groan. And Paul tells us there the Spirit can turn our groanings and our sighs into words to God. Verses 4 through 6. You've held my eyelids open. I'm troubled. Notice this. He says, I'm so troubled I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years of long ago. I'll remember my song in the night. I'll meditate with my heart, and my spirit ponders. You know, Asaph blames God for not being able to sleep. And, you know, I guess today what's the phrase we use? Our minds are racing 90 to nothing. And they seem to double at night, don't they? I mean, he's so troubled, he can't even speak. And sometimes grief does that. I mean, it literally strangles us and we feel overcome. Now, verses 5 and 6, Asaph remembered the former years. He's looking back in life and he's remembering when God blessed him. He remembers when he was leading the singing in the temple. I mean, he talks about he's lifted his hands in the temple. He received the Lord's blessings. But now he lifted his hands and he said, it seems like I'm getting nothing. Now, verses 7 through 9. He's going to record the feelings of, I think, every person in the middle of difficulty. And these feelings are recorded as questions. In fact, Asaph asked, and I got to tell you, there's six heartbreaking questions. Because they're dealing with the very character of God. And notice what he said. Notice these questions. He's thinking in his own mind. Think about this. First one, will the Lord reject forever? I mean, has God forgotten us? Number two, will he never be favorable again? Is he not going to take care of us anymore? Number three, verse 8, has his loving kindness ceased forever? Has God quit loving us? Number four, has his promise come to an end forever? In other words, he's doubting in the promises of God, right? Number five, verse 9, has God forgotten to be gracious? Where is God's grace, he's saying, in the middle of all of this difficulty? And the last question he asks, or has he in anger withdrawn his compassion? And we've probably all asked those questions and many more in the difficulties of life. But you know, the lesson, no matter what God is doing or not doing in our lives, God has not changed. His love is always there. You know, circumstances may appear to totally wreck our lives, but God is not helpless. We need to remember this. God is not helpless among the ruins. Let me ask you this question. Is it wrong to question and complain to God? Turn back a few pages to Psalm 55. And I think you know the answer to this. And just notice this psalm. I mean, we've already seen Asaph complaining. In fact, you read his psalms and they're just full of complaints to God, and God allows it. Psalm 55, this is a psalm of David. He says this in verse 2. Give heed to me and answer me. He's talking to God. And notice what he says. I'm restless in my complaint, and I'm surely distracted. Then look down to verses 16 and 17. As for me, I'll call upon God. Lord will save me. And notice this right here. I think we've all been here. Evening and morning and at noon. That's pretty much all day, isn't it? What's he say he will do? I will complain and murmur. And notice this last phrase. And he will hear my voice. Then look down to verse 22. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he'll sustain you. He'll never allow the righteous to be shaken. And notice how he closes this psalm. Even if, you know what, even if our prayers aren't answered, notice still what he says, the last phrase of verse 23, but I will trust in God. Now turn back to Psalm 77. You know, verse 10 kind of seems like a, maybe or as far as this psalm is concerned, the ultimate pity party, because he says, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. The psalm, he changes. This psalm changes, though, in the next verse. And here's what I want us, one of the lessons I want us to get. You know, our life tends to lean in the direction of our dominant thought. Verses 11 and 12. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds. You know, Asaph changes here. He decides to meditate no longer on the whys of life, and he changes to the whats. What did he remember and know about God? You know, when we have the I don't know why situations in life, we have to decide to focus on what we know. Otherwise, the I don't know whys in life, they will overwhelm us. The last few verses there, verses 13 through 20, if you notice something there, the pronouns change. I mean, the first part of the psalm, it's I and my, and all of a sudden it changes. Larry, I think the King James probably says thee and thou. The New American Standard says, oh God. Yeah, I think an important lesson for us when we look at our circumstances and when we focus on ourselves, we see no hope. But when we look by faith to the Lord, our circumstances may not change, but we can. Now, Asaph, he didn't completely solve his problems, but he moved out of the shadow of doubt into a light of confidence in the Lord. But you know, the real question that I have, you know, how much time did it take Asaph to go from verse 10 to verse 11? Verses 13 through 15, we see he looks up by faith to the greatness of God. He remembers God is holy. Verses 16 through 18. Notice what he says. The waters saw you, God. The deeps also trembled. The clouds poured out the water. He's remembering the greatness of God. Verse 19, he remembers that God is the Redeemer. And then in verse 20, he says, God, you're still our shepherd. Let me just close with this. You know, I don't even pretend to know the whys. I have my own hurts, my own losses, my own doubts, just as you have. But you know, the challenge is to keep trusting even when our lives are, you know, they feel like they've been demolished by a wrecking ball. And you know, I've asked all the questions that Asaph asked, and I've asked even more. But if we can learn anything from this psalm, here's what I want us to know. We can doubt, we can question, and we can even struggle in our faith, and God allows it. And you know, I think to really know God, we have to wrestle through pain and struggle with those honest doubts. And even live with a lot of unanswered questions. And you know, sometimes faith seems to be all we have to hold on to. And sometimes it feels like it might even be just a single thread. But let's just make sure that it's the thread of the Lord's garment. And as you can see on the PowerPoint there, trust God even if the twists and turns never make sense this side of heaven. Drew, come lead us in an invitation.